But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and get started because I am prompt and on time. So welcome to my talk. I'm going to be talking a lot about screen readers today and creating accessible rich sites with ARIA. So my name is Lindsey Kopacz, and I am a front-end Drupal developer who has a infinite passion for accessibility. And like I just said, you can follow me on Twitter. I will be posting these slides definitely, and if everything works out, a recording of this talk. And if you have a problem, like you ask a question and you don't want to be featured on YouTube, please come and tell me. I want to respect that. So, all right. So, we can go ahead and get started. Whoops, there we go. So first of all, what is ARIA? I always get really excited when I don't have to look at my computer screen and I can say accessible, rich internet applications, which defines ways to make your web content and your web applications more accessible to people with disabilities. There's a lot of accessibility basics out there. But this is particularly helpful for things that are really heavy in Ajax and in JavaScript. So that's the textbook definition. What does that really mean? It's basically giving attributes that have data to work better with screen readers or other assistive technologies. So it gives a lot more context, and it gives you a lot more understanding of what you want to hear on a screen reader. First off, I want to make this participatory, so please raise your hand. And have you ever gone through your favorite site on a screen reader using VoiceOver? It's on Macs if you have it. No, nobody. Well, this next slide is going to be really irrelevant then for you, but I'm going to read it anyway because it's there. I'm going to go ahead and just read through this. How did you feel? Did you feel that you got the context as somebody who is sighted? Did you feel confused? Did you feel irritated? Did you feel happy? So even if you haven't gone through your favorite sites with a screen reader, has anybody ever experienced a screen reader? Yes? Okay, that's good. So when I go through all this, nobody's going to be like, what the heck is it going on here? So just a quick note, I am going to access most of this through tabbing. I have a link in my resources slide all the way at the end about little shortcuts on your keyboard to navigate through a screen reader better, but I'm going to use tabs for the brevity of the recordings. So I just kind of wanted to put that disclaimer out there. So I was testing out the sound before. I have a few recordings that I've used for these. I'm going to try. It wasn't really working well with this projector thing, so I hope that you guys can all hear this. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and go through Twitter.
Home, current page, new tweets available, list 4 items, moments button. You are currently on the button. To click this button, press Control, Option, Space. Visited, link, notifications 3. Messages, button. You are, number yay, just go drill. Content selected, search query, edit text, 1 suggestion. You are currently on a text field. To enter, search Twitter, button. You are, profile and settings, pop-up button, list 2 items. You are currently on the menu. To Lindsey Kopacz, view profile, menu item, list, menu item, moments, menu item, help center, menu item, keyboard shortcuts, menu item, Twitter ads, menu item, analytics, menu item, settings and privacy, menu item, log out, new tweets available, press period to review them. You are currently on the menu item. To Lindsey Kopacz, view profile, menu item, profile and settings, pop-up button, tweet button, complimentary tweet 1 item.
Okay. See, I don't actually need this. You can all hear me whenever I don't have it on. But So a few things, I probably should have mentioned this before, but I always try to challenge myself whenever I go through a site, being like, what do I need to know about all of these attributes or all of these elements on the page? What relevant information would I need to know if I was not able to see anything? And in the next one, I personally think actually that Twitter does a very good job And that's why I'm going to use Twitter a lot in a lot more of the shorter examples. I promise most of the clips, aside from the next one, are not as long. They're going to be a lot shorter. But I think at the very least, you can probably appreciate why, if somebody who has poor sight and uses a screen reader, why it might be irritating if something isn't working for it. Twitter is like, I mean, listening to something is already kind of annoying, right? Imagine if it doesn't work well. Just a side note, in my side life, I do a lot of makeup artistry, and something I do frequently is visit Sephora.com and quietly sob because of how expensive everything I want is. It's always fun for me, fun, air quotes, for me to go through some of my favorite sites and see if they pass the test, because sometimes I like to be critical. So this one, I'm going to go through not the whole thing, but some of the portions.
Link. See more.
Oh.
You are currently on a link. Inside link. /F1908508 main-grid.jpg. Quick look on. Dior Skin Forever Perfect Foundation Broad Spectrum SPF 35. You are currently on a link. Inside of HTML content. Quick look button. You are currently on the button. Inside of a link. To click this button, prep link. /F1894996. Quick look button. You are currently on the button. Inside of a link. To click this button, press Control Option Space. Link. /F1585546 main-grid.jpg. Quick look free. Living Proof Perfect Hair Day Shampoo. You are currently on the quick look button.
Okay.
You are currently on the button. Inside of a link. To click this button, press Control Option Space.
So I'm trying really hard to be patient with these types of clips, but I will say I edited a lot of expletives out of this, especially when going through this slider. It was awful, and I wasn't sure whether or not to share that. I decided to save you guys the energy of me yelling at it, and go ahead and I'll let you guys choose for yourself when you decide to volunteer for it. So there are a lot of, okay, so with this type of site, like a shopping website, I think about that slider and I think, what would have made me a lot less irritated with that? You know, obviously if I were blind, you know, having sight in general would be less irritating, but how can ARIA help? So some things I noticed in that is there was a lot of duplication. So between every link, there is the image link, and then there was a button inside. I didn't know if those were the same thing or if they were different. I probably wanted some context if they were different. If not, I might want to hide one of those from the screen reader so it's only reading one thing. You know, that's one thing, and that's something ARIA can help with. There's other things like, hey, I want to indicate that there's a slider, right? My expletives of what I was saying in the slideshow or whatever, I don't want to go ahead and go through it, but having the context of, hey, if you want to see more, click on this arrow. Hearing that versus when I was going through everything, it was going off screen and I couldn't even deal with it. It was so irritating to me. So here are a few things to think about when you're building your sites. So, oh man, that is not 508 compliant, that like little X thing, but there is an X there. So are there any elements of my page that rely on visual cues to communicate meaning? Mobile menus are big on that, hamburger menus, X's, you know, we don't really think about it, but 3 lines, that's a visual cue saying open. An X, we don't want to repeat X to it, we want to repeat close to a screen reader. So that's one thing to think about. Are there categories on a page that need context of what they're categorizing? So this is something I've actually seen on sites that I've done where unfortunately the top level menu item was not a link, it was a placeholder. So if I'm tabbing through something and I'm tapping through with the links, I hear 2017, 2016, 2015, 2014, but I'm not hearing past events, right? So I'm not getting that context. I mean, that's just a year. We probably need to know what that year is referring to. And this is very relevant to me because I'm a Drupal developer, but are you forced to use divs in your CMS or whatever framework you use? Divs are very arbitrary, and ARIA can really help you add meaning and context to that when you don't have the ability to use semantic HTML. So I'm going to go through some of the most popular ARIA attributes that I personally use. There are several more, and I have a list of them in my resources slide. So there's, fair warning, there's going to be a few more recorded clips, not nearly as long as those first two, but I think it also helps communicate why they're important and kind of doing that whole connecting the dots thing that we like to do. So this one you may have seen before, the role attribute. It's probably the only ARIA attribute that doesn't have ARIA in it. And it's used to describe the widgets that you're talking about. And this is particularly helpful when we're talking about those CMSs that have divs on divs on divs on divs. So a lot of them that I see are articles, banners, buttons, navigation. It's a way of adding that context back in. So here's a quick example. So I'm not sure if you heard this when we were going through the Twitter example, but you might have heard some of this announcement.
Visit link, home, current page, new tweets available, moments button. You are currently on the button. To click this button, press Control, Option, visit link, notifications, messages button. You are currently on the button. To click this button, press Control, Option, space.
Okay, so as you can see right here, there is a role button, and that's why it announces as a button instead of as a link. So I honestly am not 100% sure why the moments was a button, because the notifications was not a button, the home was not a button, but the messages and the moments are. Not 100% sure I get that, but hey, it's an example, right? So these two, ARIA described by, and the next slide, ARIA labeled by. I'm going to try to talk more about the example because it's sort of hard to describe or determine the differences between them. So ARIA described by, the fun textbook definition is it identifies the element or elements that describe the object. So the value that it takes on is a string that matches the ID of the element used to describe it. So when you use an ID attribute that has HTML within it, it will announce whatever ID that connects all the children and all that stuff. So an ARIA labeled by is almost the same, but it identifies the element or elements that labels the current element, and it uses IDs very similarly to ARIA described by. So that is insanely confusing, and admittedly, I get this mixed up all the time. And also feel free to interrupt me if you want further clarification on this, because I understand it's really confusing. So this is not a Twitter example because personally I actually did not like the Twitter examples I was seeing. I found it really confusing. But something I noticed conceptually when I think about it is when I think about forms and I think about labels for fields, and then I think about help text for fields. And that's kind of how I differentiate it. And the labeled by announces before the attribute, and described by, I'm sorry, not attribute, the element, and it described by is announced after it. It's a very small difference, but you could probably see after I go through this why it's important. And what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna go through this, and then I'm gonna go through the markup, and then I'm gonna return back to this so you guys can kind of understand where that is. So, keep forgetting to do this. Sorry, guys.
Normal label example. Edit text. List 4 items. You are currently on a text field. To enter text in this field, type labeled by example. This is additional label info. Edit text. You
Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through the markup. All right, so if you notice right here, there is an ID that says additional label and says this is additional label info. Then the next one is a very basic form input and label. And then we have here the label ID for this and this up here in the labeled by attribute. And then we go further to the described by example, and we see the described by note right here as the ID, and then the described by attribute. So, does that make sense? Yeah? Can I get the vocal yes? Okay, cool. Sorry, sometimes I see the like blank stares and I'm like, does that actually mean I explained this well? I don't know. So if I go back to this, so I'm really sorry. This thing isn't working, so I have to do it the old-fashioned way right here.
Normal label example. Edit text. List 4 items. You are currently on a text field. To enter text in this field, type labeled by example. This is additional label info. Edit text. You are currently on a text. Described by example. Edit text. This is a note about the field. You are currently on a text field. To enter text in this field, type labeled by and described by example. This is additional label info. Edit text. This is a note about the field. You are currently on a text field. To enter text in this field, type.
Okay, so do people understand that? I never trust it because it took me forever.
In the Drupal world, the label would be the field label and the described by would be the description of the field.
Yeah, exactly. So I think I was looking for examples for quite a while of how to explain this in a way that really made intuitive sense. And thinking about it in terms of forms probably was the most intuitive. Something I've seen, I actually think it's the best way to use it properly. Sometimes I see ARIA described by particularly used for non-form things, and then the problem with doing it that way is you get a lot more information than you need after you hit it. So something I noticed in Twitter was if you open the tweet box, which you can access with the keyboard, by the way, which is really awesome, and that part I'm really excited about. But you go through or you open it up, and then you hear a crap ton of information about things you don't really need to hear because you're going to tab through all of the other items. So it will literally open up and it'll be like compose new tweet and picture and what are all the things, location and GIF and blah, blah, blah. And it'll announce it all at once. And I find that really overwhelming. As somebody who can see it, I imagine that it might even be more overwhelming if you couldn't see it. So, but yeah, definitely a good way to think about it is help text versus field labels. So, any other questions? Yeah? Okay. I wanted to make sure that everybody understood that because I still get kind of tossed up by it. Oops. All right, ARIA expanded. This is actually probably one I see second most. Role is the one I see the most. It kind of indicates whether the element or the groupings are open or closed, are expanded or collapsed. It takes on a Boolean, so true or false. And this one is typically triggered by JavaScript, and the JavaScript will set the attribute to different values. So this one isn't a video example, but because it's more giving context. So if you look here, the ARIA expanded is true. And you see up here that it is open. If you have the ARIA expanded false, see here, you don't see any of that extra search, save searches info. So, all right. ARIA has pop-up. Not to be confused with ARIA expanded. This is another one that I always kind of got confused. But the best way to think about it is the ARIA has pop-up does not change states, really. It either has a pop-up or it doesn't. The default value is always going to be false, so unless you set it to true, it's not going to say anything about it. I always got this confused because, expanded to me also implies that something pops up, but expanded is more about the state of it, if it is expanded or collapsed, and ARIA pop-up is more about like the property itself. So this is also a Boolean, and you might have heard it in the Twitter example, but
Profile and settings pop-up button. You are currently on a pop-up button.
sorry, did you guys all hear that? No? All right, I'm good. My bad.
Profile and settings pop-up button. You are currently on a pop-up button.
Okay, did you hear that? Good, okay. Sorry about that. So if you notice right here, it has the ARIA pop-up set to true. So also, fun fact, screen readers actually pronounce my last name the Polish way, which is really fun. But I noticed that when I was going through all of my screen reader tests. I thought it was kind of funny. But anyway, that's a tangent. Okay, ARIA hidden. So I used to be very annoyed by this because when I first started learning about accessibility, I'm like, why would you hide things from users? That makes no sense to me. And it turns out there's actually a lot of reasons to hide things. To be perfectly honest, this is a textbook definition of it, and I don't really like it. It indicates that the element and all of its descendants are not visible or perceivable to any users as implemented by the author. The example that I have after this actually doesn't really fit that, to be honest. It also takes a Boolean, but for me, ARIA hidden is more about what is the semantic value of having it announced? And is it going to make it more confusing to announce it versus not announce it? So I'm going to really quickly go through all of this markup. So when I inspect the element on the home button up top, within the anchor tag, I have all of this. So we have 4 lines of spans. We have the span class text that has an ARIA hidden home. And then we have 3 others that are visually hidden. I don't know if any of you are new to accessibility, but visually hidden is this thing that you should always do instead of display none, because basically what it does is it just puts it off the screen and hides the overflow, but it's still technically there as markup. So there are 3 lines, and we have home, then we have home current page, and then we have new tweets available. Can anybody take any guesses of what those all mean? Yes? Anybody? Okay. Yay! Exactly. So it also talks about home if you are on the current page is the home page. And it also, Twitter is really good this way. If new tweets become available while you're on it, it will also announce that. So something I'm going to challenge you guys. Why would we have the ARIA hidden true on this first span? Does anybody have any ideas?
You don't hear home 3 times in a row.
Exactly. So that's exactly why it's relevant. So we have 3 spans, and those are not for the visual experience. That ARIA hidden one is for the visual experience. So when we're listening to the screen reader, we can hear, oh, this is the stuff that we hear. This is specifically for the screen reader. And the ARIA hidden equals true. That's the one that we see on the visual side. And I was very careful to make sure that that was true. I was like, which one is it when I look at this? And it is the one that is ARIA hidden equals true. So, sorry.
Visited link home current page new tweets available as keyboard focus. You are currently To click this link, press Control, Option, Space.
So you see why that's kind of important there? Like, what it reads is all of the visually hidden stuff, but we don't want all of those duplicative home, current page, and like it just would annoy you. So that's an instance where, is this technically accessible? Yes, but would it annoy you to hear something a million times? Yes. It's all about empathy here. ARIA labels. So this one I have very mixed feelings about. It is one of the few, maybe even the only ARIA attribute where you define the string, meaning it's not a Boolean, it doesn't have to match an ID, it is literally a string with whatever you create it. The reason why I have problems with this is I'd prefer the markup to exist on the page and have something referring to it. But sometimes the markup isn't existing. I don't know, you have a deadline, can't do all these custom markup things that you're creating. I don't know, like there could be a reason, but it essentially is defining the string value yourself. So a visual example, this is the wrapper to all of those tweet actions. So the reply, the retweet, and the like button are all wrapped around with this div that has the ARIA label tweet actions. So it gives a little bit more context of what those are. I would have preferred to do it a different way, but hey, it gets the job done, yeah? So ARIA required. So ARIA required indicates that user input is required. So this is particularly helpful on HTML forms. HTML4 forms. It's a tongue twister, because HTML5 introduces a lot more semantic HTML, and it also introduces the required attribute. So this would take on a Boolean as well, true or false. So I didn't have any examples of that one because Twitter honestly doesn't have it because it uses mostly HTML5. So with HTML5 being spoken about, I want to talk a little bit about that. So HTML5 makes much better use of semantic HTML than HTML4. And I want to say that HTML5 can be supported by ARIA, but I personally would much rather you fix any issues with semantic HTML. Sometimes there's instances where you use both. For example, browser requirements. That's a really good reason to use it, but sometimes I think that when you're using a nav element and then saying role navigation, unless you're supporting a lot of older browsers, it could become a little bit redundant. So this is something I'm actually really passionate about, is human testing is completely valuable. And sometimes when you get those really long 508 compliance reports, does anybody get those? Yeah, they're very overwhelming. Because especially when there's something in the header and it appears on every single page of your site. And you're like, I, of course, must have messed it up 28 pages worth, but you laugh because you know what I'm talking about. But they don't flag missing ARIA attributes. So the example that I was talking about way back slides ago, where I was talking about the dates, or I'm sorry, the years, that technically would not flag. I remember I found that as an issue when I was physically going through and testing something with JAWS, which is really fun, air quotes. And I was like, man, there's not a lot of context to this. I have no idea what these list items mean. If I had my eyes closed, I would just hear a bunch of dates, and that's really not helpful to me. And so what I did is I grabbed context from what using JavaScript, I grabbed a couple of parent levels up, and I used that to connect the ARIA. I think I used an ARIA labeled by and then used that to connect it. And it really helped to announce what everything was. So go through, and if something is going to annoy you, like some of the things that I did at the beginning, it is going to annoy everybody who uses a screen reader or any sort of assistive technology. So it's really valuable. Your gut feelings, they really are important here. And it's not a jargony report. It's you're making something better for somebody. You're being an empathetic developer. So building with accessibility in mind. So I see a lot of people using ARIA to fix things that are crappily built. I really don't like that. Whenever I build a site, I personally, even if it takes a little bit longer, I will make sure and I run it through the wave tool before I start styling it. Very important, before I start styling it. I make sure that all of my images can support alt tags. I make sure that my forms are attached. The labels are attached to the inputs. That's a big one, especially if you have mobile searches. Just, heads up, have had to do that from experience. And making sure heading levels are supported. Those you should always think about first. And then that way when you start building things and you start styling it, that you know that if you get an accessibility report, you're not going to have to redo a bunch of stuff. Versus adding ARIA isn't redoing, it's enhancing. So, sometimes, I will go through with the human testing, not the accessibility reports, and I'll go through and I'm like, all right, this technically works, but I want it to be a little bit better. And that's where I'll add an ARIA attribute in. And shameless plug, if you need some introduction on accessibility, I've presented about it and it's on that link. So I'm running a little bit shorter than I thought I would. Here are the resources. It will be obviously on my Twitter later, and then I have to do the thank you to the sponsors, because without sponsors, I'm unable to speak to you guys and share my knowledge about accessibility, and there's no conference for you all to attend. And please rate my talk, but because I am running under, are there any questions? Yes?
Can you go back to the example I used for ARIA?
Sure, except Reveal decides that when I refresh things, it makes me go all the way through. So 1 second. You said for ARIA hidden?
For ARIA hidden.
Okay, sure. Oh, there we go.
So the interesting thing, well, it's actually the example itself.
Oh, okay, sure.
The interesting thing to me here is that there's two spans for home.
Mm-hmm.
One of them has the ARIA hidden attribute, and the other one doesn't.
Okay.
What do you think the balance is between having syntax and having HTML that works both for visually and visually impaired people, and kind of building out two different HTML structures? One, everything is hidden, so you don't have to worry about it, and one, everything is there for visually.
That's a great question. So just to repeat it in case anybody didn't hear, we were talking about the value of having all of having home mentioned a few times here, and what's the value of doing that versus just making it work for everyone. Well, I like to say that make it work for everyone is the better thing to do here, but I am not the technical architect of Twitter. I don't make the decisions for them. And that's kind of why I sort of did the whole only to enhance things, build it with semantic HTML first, and then enhance it the way you are. What I would have done is actually remove the ARIA hidden. And to be honest, hearing that home is the current page, that might be helpful. I'm not 100% sure if there's value, because screen readers announce what URL you're on anyway when you click on it. So for me, I'm not 100% that's 100%. or that's relevant. But I would keep the new tweets available because that is not redundant. That is valuable information. Something I personally really like about Twitter, and I want to, see how they do it and find out their code and figure out how they did it, is whenever there's a load of new tweets, like, sometimes they'll be like, oh, 3 more tweets got loaded. It will interrupt the screen reader and say, new tweets available, press period to view them. I don't know if you guys heard that in the original example, but I was obsessing over these demos, so I heard it quite a few times, and I found that really, really, I was like, that's cool. That's a great thing to tell your users, and I got excited about it. Maybe people don't get excited about the same things I do, but all right. Any more questions? Yes.
Just quick on the roles that you list are the banner button form main navigation region. Are those a preset list, or can you put just about anything that is semantic?
That's another good question. The question was, are there a preset list of roles? And yes, there are. You can't put whatever the heck you want in there. The only thing that I know of that you could put whatever the heck you want in there are ARIA labels. I actually have a list on my resources that says all the possible roles you can have. Those were the ones that were on my slide were the most common ones. So yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any. I'm pretty much preset. So sure.
It's fair to say that all of these things will fall back to the base HTML thing if it's available. So if your label element has a 4 attribute, you do not need to do the label 5.
I kind of like simplistic HTML. My opinion is always don't overcomplicate it, right? Because screen readers understand semantic HTML really well. So I always go with, yes, make it the most basic. But the reason why I kind of bring up ARIA stuff is when I'm testing things as a human and going through it and being like, maybe that needs a little more context, maybe it needs a little extra help. For example, you have a search, and it is very obvious to a sighted user what you're searching for, but you don't want to label it search. You want to label it something else, right? Maybe you're only searching for certain things within your site. That would probably be a really good thing to add an ARIA labeled by for, because then you're giving the person who cannot see, the user that can't see, you're giving them that extra context of, hey, this is what it's actually searching for. Where it might be visually obvious to somebody who has sight, it might not be obvious to somebody who's using a screen reader. So, but usually simplistic forms work perfectly fine. In fact, you should, and I'm glad you said the 4. That makes me happy when I know people know that. So, but just because now I did a random blurb, you should always attach your inputs IDs to a label 4 and match it similarly to what you would do ARIA labeled by and ARIA described by. Do you have a question? No? Stretching? Okay. Yeah?
In the screen reader world, is ARIA sort of the de facto standard for this kind of description, or are there competitors? I'm wondering, similar to the way that CSS uses browser prefixes for WebKit versus Firefox browser, that kind of thing. Is there a similar paradigm here, or is this the standard?
Well, not that I'm aware of, unless you're counting HTML5. HTML5 has added way more semantic HTML. Now you have nav, and now you have section, and now you have, header, and all these other things that just are a lot more semantic, than what it was before. But the thing is some older browsers don't use it. I think when it comes down to it, if you're able to fix everything with semantic HTML, that works. And this is where, human testing actually helps, because then you're like, it's kind of the same thing as browser testing, you always think you're gonna make things perfect and it's gonna look good on every device, and then all of a sudden you're testing and you get all these tickets about this one thing that happened on one browser, and you're like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that was a thing. So you know, that's why the human testing is really important. So, but yeah, that's a good question though. Any other questions? Yes.
If you're limited on a project where you only have a certain amount of time to address accessibility, are there certain main things you try to hit first?
Yeah. So obviously, if you know you're a tech lead, I always try to look at the contract first and make sure make sure that I know what standards we need to hold it by. So for the most part, if we have a short budget, I always try to make sure that it is very apparent to the developers who are doing the initial build what the accessibility standards are that we are that we're going to follow. So what I personally do is because you know I'm obsessed with accessibility, is I put maybe a little extra time at the beginning to make sure that my form labels are working and making sure that something that happens a lot. I'm giving you this forewarning. You know, you're only allowed to use one ID on a page, right? You know, that's like basic HTML standards, is you're not supposed to repeat IDs. But a lot of times what I see is there is a mobile search, and it's in a different place of the page. So you'll have the same form in two different places, and guess what? If it's accessible, it should have an ID. I always make sure to figure out a way to address that ID issue before, because you know what? Lazy devs don't like things at the end of projects. They don't like getting tickets coming back to them. I identify sometimes as a lazy dev when it comes to that type of stuff. I'd rather nip it in the butt right away than have to go back and deal with, you know, whatever JIRA tickets are coming for things that I knew I should have addressed, but I didn't feel like it. So I guess that doesn't make me lazy. I don't know. But always starting with the beginning, you know, and the human factor of you know, making sure there's extra context, those are things that I always try to do toward the end, and I will prioritize them based off of, you know, for example, I would prioritize something like hiding something that was unnecessary a lot more than I would prioritize something like, hey, this date needs a slight extra context to it to make sense. Because for me, I find it a lot more irritating to hear things multiple times than I do to be like, okay, if I just, like, because you have the ability to use other buttons aside from tabbing. So if somebody can tap up, they can get that context. It's just not as accessible with tabbing. So I think it's also just prioritization, and always beginning the start of your project with building those things in. Because trust me, speaking from experience, restyling a bunch of headers because you didn't make your headers compliant sucks. Yes?
Do you know if there are any tools that can validate what kind of standard you are in from accessibility?
Oh, yes.
A1, A2, I don't remember the names, but different levels, right?
I am very glad you asked that. So the question was, what are some fun tools to use? Something I always do as a quick check is I use the Wave tool. And if it's not on my resources slide, I will add it before I post it, because that is a very good point. So Wave will go through the HTML. It's free. That's also important. It is free. It is a Chrome, and I believe it's also a Firefox extension. And it will go through the errors. It'll go through contrast. That's another big one for designers. It will go through what are like well, that's kind of annoying, but you know, it's fine. And then it'll point out all the ARIA attributes that are going on, and it will also point out header levels. So it's really, really interesting to look through, and that's something I will constantly click on. Actually, I don't know if you can see it, but it's this one right here. That's what the icon looks like. If you guys can see it, it might be grayed out because of the QuickTime recording, but I constantly will be clicking on it when I'm doing active development. Mm-hmm.
My question is related to just mentioned. How often do you see, you mentioned that sometimes accessibility before don't have listing attributes.
Right.
When you use the array or any tool, how often do you see that?
Can you repeat the last part of your question? I'm sorry.
How often do you see the missing ARIA attributes?
Oh, how often do I see it? Probably, so whenever I see missing ARIA attributes, it usually is connected to something that's missing in semantic HTML, and it'll say, we need this to be identified as this, or we need an ARIA attribute. So most of the time I see it in conjunction with other things, like you have this option to fix it or this option to fix it. I don't see a lot, trying to go through every single accessibility report I've ever gone in my lifetime. But to my recollection, I can't remember a time where I had in a report that says, you need to have ARIA stuff in it. ARIA is not something you should rely on for accessibility. It is to help enhance accessibility. And if you get nothing else from this talk, that's what I want you to remember. So, any other questions? Yeah?
Is it possible to make, say, a drag and drop accessible?
Sure. So I actually have not personally done a drag and drop, but I would always talk to your project managers and tech leads about budget and talk to them about it before it is being built. So I had an instance on a project where we had a really, how do I say this nicely? A really crappily marked up accordion. And I had to make that accessible. And, you know, I usually want to, I don't even know how to approach it. It was a migration project, so I had to work with the migration, or with the items that were given to me. I wasn't able to alter the markup because it was a one-to-one migration. And it was all a bunch of LIs and ULs. So not only could I, not only was it not announcing things well or telling me what to do with it, it was also not even tabbable because they were using things that on standard have a tab index of -1, which if you haven't worked with tab indexes, tab index of -1 is pretty much any, I'm trying to not make generalizations, but it's something that if you tab on it, it's gonna skip it if it's a -1 versus a 0 or any other positive integer, it will not skip it. So everything in a unordered list has a tab index of -1. So not only did I have to go through and make it make sense to a screen reader, I also had to make sure that it could be tabbed with a screen reader, or in general. Tabbing isn't just for screen readers, it's for people who also have motor issues, and you know, developers. I don't use my mouse very much anymore, but yeah, so I have not personally done a drag and drop menu, but something that I would think about is, first of all, building it and seeing how you can build it in a way that uses minimal ARIA. And if you can't do that, making sure you're using ARIA effectively to announce what it's doing. I think that's the biggest thing that I would flag, is just being like, okay, we need to make sure that when the user is interacting with that element, they know what's happening. So, does that answer your question? Great. I'm actually kind of glad that, you know, I was short, because these are all really great questions. Yes?
You mentioned contracts and budgets a couple of times. If you have a client who's not particularly interested in accessibility, do you have a strategy for arguing to take the extra time to do some of this?
So the question is how, you know, how do you convince people that it's worth it? Because, you know, there's budgets and scope and all that fun stuff. One thing that a good way to do it at first is to build it into your contracts. If you can't do that and it's like a new thing, it all comes down to like, you know, there's two ways. One I like and one is kind of a cop-out. One is, well, you know, usability isn't just about user experience for the sighted user. If something isn't working for a screen reader, it doesn't work. That doesn't always win. This is my be a good person clause. Then there's the part that, hey, we could lose money, particularly if it's an e-commerce site. That one is usually really effective. So sorry to bring politics into this. I'm not going to put any affiliation, but one thing I did for my talk that I did where I was introducing it is it was before the election, and I went to both candidates' donate pages, and both of them were awful. Like, really awful. Like, errors were like in the 70s or something insane. There are things like credit card fields didn't have labels. Imagine like being somebody who you're like, I'm not putting my secure information in some random field, you know, it's just something like that. And if somebody is going to feel that way, they are not going to put their credit card number in. They're not going to donate to that party, or the candidate rather. And you know, it's the same thing with e-commerce. You know, yes, you might not have the access or the budget for going through all the ARIA stuff, but you could. I mean, it's basically HTML, right? It's good, high quality markup that really helps with accessibility. So, I mean, if you can't do the, you know, be a good person, you can always, for the most part, being like, hey, yeah, I know it's a time investment, but I don't, oh, wait, I forgot the other one. You could get sued. That's another one. Sorry, that's actually kind of important. That one would probably be more. Nobody wants to get sued. There's that, but then there's also the fact that it's getting more well-known about these types of issues, and a lot of times there can always be a case for discrimination if you don't make something work well for somebody who has a disability because of the ADA Act. So, cool, good question. Any other questions? No? Well, if you have any other questions, feel free to find me. You can always find me on Twitter. If I refresh this. You can always find me on Twitter and interact with me that way. And I'll also be here until Friday, so you can always just talk to me in person and ask me about it. But thank you so much for coming, and thank you all for your insightful questions that filled up the last half hour of my talk. But yeah, all right, fabulous. Thank you for coming.